Hello. Good evening to all of you. This wonderful room with so many students and professors and friends of the Instituut Estudos Políticos Catholic University. It is a joy to discuss politics in person, to debate and to keep on the conversation. How very, very honorable director, Professor João Carlos Espada, always uses to say, learning politics and making politics is exactly about this. Coming together, discussing, exchanging views, negotiating, listening, learning, and giving a contribution. Being original, but being responsible, especially. And this all in the name of freedom, and I would add democracy. That's a beautiful motto to start this evening session here, and I feel very honored. Unfortunately, our Vice Rector, Professor Margarida Mano, cannot be here for familiar reasons, and we start anyway, and so in a very humble way, I will try to give my best to conduct this panel here that we will be starting now. So the panel this evening will go on the conversation that we had before and the very interesting insights we all received, and we want to go on and to debate. So the topic now is the Atlantic Charter at 80, renewing the democratic alliance for the 21st century. Memory is very important to build the future, and we only see from the past what is important for us in the present. This is why we're all here, because this is important for us. This is important for the Instituut Estudos Políticos, the tradition of the Atlantic Charter. And I feel very privileged to start then the debate we are going to conduct here with incredible speakers that are marking the political debate, not only in the last 5 or 10 years or 20 years, but for a very long time. So we will have a lot to learn, to listen, to learn, but then also to speak. And I would like to start by opening up the video for a dear friend that cannot be with us today, and that is the Honourable Lord Plant from King's College London and House of Lords. Professor Raymond Plant comes to these meetings for over 20 years. And this year he cannot be here, well, directly and in person, but we have a video that he recorded for us. And so I would like to start with this video and the certainly wise words he will have to inspire our debate.
Well, I had hoped to be able to deliver this short introduction to the importance of Ralph Dahrendorf's work in person, but I'm afraid family problems have made that impossible just at the moment. So you're going to be subjected to my first and quite possibly my last Zoom talk. I'm delighted to be able to introduce the lecture because Ralph Dahrendorf was quite a close friend of mine, and I certainly miss his presence even after several years following his death. We were both colleagues as heads of college in Oxford, he of St Anthony's College, me of St Catherine's College. And of course, we were also brought together particularly by Professor Espada, who was, as many of you will know, a graduate student with Professor Dahrendorf. And I was in Oxford at the same time, and we got to know one another. Ralph Dahrendorf and I got to know one another through Professor Espada. I think it's important to keep Ralph Dahrendorf's memory alive, which is part of the point of the lecture, because he was very centered on the idea of, on the one hand, enjoying the freedoms, the rights, the flexibility, and so forth, which a free market economy and a liberal state can produce. At the same time, he was very sensitive to the claims that the market, the liberal state, and so forth, don't pay sufficient attention to the idea of community or solidarity. And he spent quite a lot of the latter part of his life, I think, thinking about how modern societies can do justice to a deep-seated desire for some sense of community, while at the same time preserving the freedoms and opportunities of a liberal society. Um, he was obviously, particularly in his earlier writings, he was very critical of the idea of community because he was a very young man in the Nazi period in Germany. And of course, one of the central components of that ideology was the idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, of a community of a racially identical and pure people. And of course, Dahrendorf utterly rejected any such idea of community. And what he spent his time doing, particularly, as I say, in the latter part of his life, was trying to think through how a modern sense of community could be created while at the same time respecting the uh, the freedoms and so forth of a liberal capitalist society. And this had a practical side to it as well. For about 10, 12 years, we both served together on a panel that was set up to award a prize for um, developments in responsible capitalism. Now, Ralph, unlike many people, many progressives, didn't see the idea of responsible capitalism as an oxymoron. Rather, it was a kind of condition of effective working of capitalism, that it had a degree of responsibility for all sorts of aspects of modern society, as well as the economic. And it was a great privilege, really, to sit with him and several other intellectuals and politicians and so forth each year to award this prize. Um, I have to say that um, the process was very much eased by the fact that we always met over breakfast in the Ritz Hotel in Piccadilly. So it was a very nice event, as well as being quite an important event. And usually we had a senior politician to present the prize, the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And this was very much, had been very much Ralph Dahrendorf's idea. It was very much his initiative. And I think that notion of responsible capitalism is one that his later work will be remembered for, because it's still an issue for us, and of course has been an issue and a thread through all the annual meetings of the Politics Institute at the Catholic University, in which I've been very pleased and proud to be associated with for many years. And it's a matter of deep regret that I can't be there this year.
Thank you very, very much to our dear Professor Raymond Plant. And I have the honor now to give the floor to our moderator of this panel. This is Joanne Balsemão. And in the previous panel, we were precisely discussing about the importance of citizenship. So it is really an extraordinary opportunity to have someone who really comes from this field. So Joanne Balsmau is Executive Counselor for Environment and Citizenship. She has a master's degree on environmental change and management from Oxford University, and she was also the coordinator of the local Agenda 21 in the Council of Cascais. So she really works with the topic of citizenship and how citizenship makes an importance, has an important role in bringing more consciousness to the questions of environment, but also in creating a more participatory idea of democracy. She is the advisor to the Portuguese permanent representation to the European Union in Brussels, and she worked for a very long time as an advisor at the Ministry of Environment. So the floor is yours in this Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture on precisely renewing the democratic alliance for the 21st century. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Professor João Carlos Pada for the invitation. Greetings to the table and to the students and faculty. So I'm the first representative of the Cascais Council to speak. I was here last year. Actually, we were like behind little squares, and now it's good not to be behind little squares. I have a note from the mayor, Carlos Carreiras, who is a great friend of IEP and Católica and this forum, but unfortunately this year's forum coincided with the municipal election cycle. So it's difficult to get hold of one of us in the executive. So I'm the privileged one to be here again with you. And I do say it's a privilege because I think I share the same interest and passion for debates and sort of especially critical debates, constructive debates that you guys do. So thank you for keeping this forum alive and for having me here again. And so today's panel is about the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is very much about democracy. It's a truly holistic foundational charter in the sense that it's not just about the military side of politics. It also talked about fair exchange of goods. It talked about self-determination and a lot more, as you know. I don't want to preach to the converted, but if the topic is democracy, then I'd like to open a short parenthesis to mention General Colin Powell, who was a man of democracy and freedoms. I represent the local level. The Atlantic Charter was signed by nation states. Nation states define geopolitics. They define big overarching principles. I'm a local decision maker. I do micropolitics, and I take baby steps that I hope will make people's lives better. But in fact, both the micro and the macro level are completely interrelated. You need to have the subsidiary level, the most subsidiary level, me, to help overarching principles materialize in a way. So since you are all studying, I'm speaking to the students now, these kinds of issues, this is my sort of small pitch to keep this in mind. All of these levels, from the local to the national to the multilateral, they all intertwine in a way, and we need each other to make things happen. Very briefly, I have two hats here in Cascais, so one is environmental policies and the other one is citizenship. And we work hard here to go beyond just representative democracy that happens every 4 years. We work really hard at participatory democracy, and there's loads of projects. I won't bore you, but I would like to highlight one of them. It's called the Participatory Budgets. And through this project, we've had it for 10 years. We really bring in citizens and empower them to co-create and co-decide with us. Citizens are entitled to decide on what kind of projects they would like public money to be spent on. The last session we had, we gave out 10 million euros. And that's about 16% of investment budget in Cascais. It's quite a lot for citizens' projects to come alive through a really participatory budget. My other hat is environmental policies. And you might ask, so what is this, why is this related to democracy? I think nowadays there is no democracy without sustainability. I would say for two reasons. One, because ideology also counts in environmental policies, but mainly the second reason, I think, is because democracy is, environmental sustainability, is a precondition, every day it's getting stronger, as a precondition to economic and political freedom. If you look at climate change and the threat it represents, I think it doesn't need any further explanation. So, this is my short introduction, and now I'll give the floor to Professor Galston.
Well, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Professor Espada for this. I believe it is my second invitation to deliver a Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture, which makes me, I guess in the language of criminal justice, a repeat offender. Having said this, I wish with all my heart that I were not delivering a lecture right now. And I say that because the first two panels have put just about every question of significance on the table already. I would love to rip up this speech and enter the debate. The spirit of democracy is dialogue, not monologue. I deeply believe that. But I also believe in doing my duty. And it is my duty to deliver this lecture, a pleasant duty, I should say. And I'm going to read it because that is the only way that I can comply with a strict time limit of 25 minutes, which I am informed will be strictly enforced. As a believer in the rule of law, I understand with Hobbes that there is no rule of law without enforcement. As we meet to remember the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, which set the stage for one of the great triumphs in human history, we must look with fresh eyes on the very different challenges that we face today. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt had the right answers for their time. But we now live in very different times. It is a time for reflection and innovation and not celebration. Let me begin by taking you back 3 decades to 1991, when I would say a majority of the people in this room had not yet been born. The year the Soviet Union collapsed. It's hard to recapture how the world felt in 1991. Suffice it to say that after defeating fascism on the battlefield and communism without firing a shot, a sense of triumph suffused the Western world. The last alternative to liberal democracy had vanished, or so we thought. The task now was to set all nations on the path to political democracy and market economies, and these efforts were linked. Economic growth would fuel the transition to democracy, or so we thought. Throughout the 1990s, this confidence seemed borne out by events. A democratic wave swept through the former captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe. Russia adopted democratic institutions, and democracy was on the march in most parts of the world. There were even signs of apparent liberalization in China as its economy grew and its relationship with the West deepened. Although the 9/11 attack on the United States was an early warning that liberal democracy still had enemies, it did not fundamentally disrupt the narrative of democratic advance, which continued, as Carl Gershman reminded us earlier, until 2006. And then, for reasons too complex to review today, the advance halted and reversed. Some of the decline was internal, but compared to 3 decades ago, the external threat to democracy, mainly from a resurgent Russia and a rising China, has intensified. This threat from the outside rather than the inside is the focus of my remarks today. And I think everybody knows why this focus is indicated, so I can be brief. Russia has repeatedly breached or altered international boundaries. It is doing its best to strangle democracy in Ukraine, and it has mounted potent disinformation campaigns against many Western democracies, including the United States. China, for its part, has broken its agreement to respect Hong Kong's free institutions. It is working to threaten democracies throughout the Pacific, and the threat that it poses to Taiwan's independence becomes graver with every passing month. And now I reach the paragraph in my talk that I hope students will pay attention to, even if I put you to sleep for the other 10.5 pages. Because this is the essence of my message. For the first time since the end of World War II, the United States now faces a struggle on 2 fronts. It is the most powerful member, not only of a long-established transatlantic alliance to contain and deter Russia, but also of a gathering alliance to prevent China from dominating the Pacific. These 2 alliances are interdependent. What happens in one will affect the other, in no small measure because American power is central to both. America must recognize that as the leader of these great assemblages of nations, it must deal openly with its allies and act on its own only when it has no other choice. But for its part, Europe must recognize that its stance on Pacific issues will have repercussions for transatlantic concerns. This new reality shapes the difficulties the transatlantic alliance now faces. We cannot stand shoulder to shoulder unless we see eye to eye. But in too many areas, we do not. I wish I could say that the United States has regularly given appropriate weight to the collective sentiments of the transatlantic alliance, but we all know that this has not been the case. I need not dwell on the consequences of my country's ill-advised decision to invade Iraq, or on a recent administration that viewed NATO with skepticism and the EU with open hostility. In recent years, moreover, America's political stability, on which our European allies have relied for decades, has given way to partisan polarization, populist uprisings, and dizzying policy shifts. Whether the current administration represents a return to stability or rather the latest chapter of oscillation is anyone's guess. The sad events in Kabul have only increased this uncertainty. From Tallinn on the Baltic to Taipei in the Pacific, the way in which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan has raised new doubts about the credibility of its commitment to its allies when the going gets tough. America's NATO allies have just cause for complaint about the impediments American policy has created for the evacuation of their citizens and of the Afghans who have worked with them. Washington's failure to consult countries who honored NATO's Article 5 obligations and fought by our side for 2 decades contradicts the basic operational requirements for effective internationalism. America's recent decision to scrap its contract with France for conventional submarines, rather Australians, it might have been America's, but that's a different point, has made matters worse. Although this move can be defended on the merits, the way in which it was carried out generated concern throughout Europe, and France was understandably outraged, while many others wondered whether it was the harbinger of a pivot to Asia at Europe's expense. In a recent press conference, France's President Macron bluntly summarized these concerns, and I quote from President Macron, "The United States has been very focused on itself and has strategic interests that are being reoriented towards China and the Pacific," he said. "It is their right to do so," he continued, "but we," by we he meant Europe, "would be naive not to draw the consequences." In these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that creating an independent European defense force is once again on the agenda. Although even Mr. Macron has conceded that strengthening Europe's defense capability would occur, quote, "within the framework of NATO." One thing is clear. The United States should allow Europe to decide this matter for itself and focus instead on what it must do to restore its credibility as a reliable partner. This must begin with a concerted effort to forge a 21st century American security policy that can be sustained through changes of party and administration. In an era of renewed great power competition, this means, above all, reaching agreement across party lines on America's stance towards Russia and China. And on this crucial matter, I have mixed news for this audience. On the one hand, there's a growing consensus within my country that America must do more to resist the expansion of China's military, diplomatic, and economic influence. Although there's not yet agreement on the size and shape of the military forces needed to deter potential aggression, the United States is finally on track to boost public investment in the technologies that will determine the relative power of the two great Pacific powers for decades to come. Taken together, the AUKUS agreement and the Quad represent the emergence of an American-led alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific. Regrettably, and this is bad news, the long-standing American consensus on the threat Russia poses has weakened, although, hopefully, less than the tumult of recent years might suggest. It should be clear to all Americans, regardless of party, that wherever possible, Russia will use its power to weaken the position of the United States and its democratic allies around the world. It should also be clear that Vladimir Putin, who regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical catastrophe, will do everything he can to restore Russia's sphere of influence from Central Asia to Ukraine. Despite America's war weariness, there's reason to hope that American leaders can forge a united stance towards Russia with which its transatlantic allies can agree. And as the consequences of pandemics and climate change become more evident to Americans in all parts of my country, there's reason to hope that differences within the United States and with its allies about the existence and importance of transnational threats will diminish. In the meantime, to repeat, the United States must curb the unilateralist tendencies that from George W. Bush's administrations to Joe Biden's have so disturbed its European allies. If America acts selfishly as well as unreliably, the alliance that has secured peace and prosperity for generations cannot endure indefinitely. But not all the difficulties with the transatlantic alliance originate on my side of the Atlantic. So for the next few minutes, I will respond affirmatively to Wilhelm Hofmeister's recommendation that there be frank talk among democratic allies. So, over strong U.S. objections, Germany completed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, cementing its energy dependence on Russia and weakening Ukraine's embattled democracy. And you may have noticed that Mr. Putin has not been slow to use the increased political leverage that this pipeline represents. Just Look at headlines from the past few days. For its part, France has joined with Germany to push for a more conciliatory stance towards Russia than the United States and most Central and Eastern European countries can accept. But the breach with the United States over policies in the Pacific goes even deeper. In a speech to the World Economic Forum this past January, German Chancellor Angela Merkel rejected a firm stance towards China, which is the emerging core of 21st century American statecraft, endorsed by both of our political parties who agree on almost nothing else. And here's what Chancellor Merkel had to say, quote, "I would very much wish to avoid the building of blocks. I don't think it would do justice to many societies if we were to say that this is the United States and over there is China and we are grouping around either one or the other. This is not my understanding of how things ought to be," close quote. Speaking to the Atlantic Council, a month later, French President Emmanuel Macron called the cries for European unity against China, quote, "counterproductive." And in case anyone had missed the point, he sent his foreign minister, Mr. Bruno Le Maire, out to declare just a couple of weeks ago that, quote, "the United States wants to confront China. The European Union wants to engage China." You cannot put the issue more bluntly than that. If the leaders of Europe's two most powerful nations are serious about adopting a policy of neutrality in the growing struggle between the United States and China, there are bound to be negative repercussions for transatlantic relations. The same, I would add, goes for the prospective trade treaty between the EU and China, which has stalled but which has not yet been abandoned. Consider finally the astounding fact that state-owned Chinese firms now hold substantial stakes in over a dozen European ports, including 2 in Spain, but none, thankfully, in Portugal. One of these Chinese firms enjoys operating control of the Greek port of Piraeus until at least 2052 and has already invested nearly $1 billion to upgrade the port's facilities. I wonder, is it a coincidence that Greece blocked an EU resolution condemning China's crackdown on pro-democracy dissidents, calling the criticism of China, and I quote, "unconstructive"? Greece's shipping minister bluntly defended his country's actions. Quote, "Greece has the right to make a decision based on its own interests," close quote. This is the logic that has allowed China to create a system of Trojan ports in the heart of Europe. What is to be done? Answering this question is our hardest challenge, and what I say today is a bare beginning. By the way, moderator, my watch indicates that I have 10 minutes left. Is that correct? Good. That's all I'll need. I start with a statement of principle. An alliance of democracies must be an alliance for democracy, and therefore an alliance against the enemies of democracy. It must be an alliance that promotes liberal democracy with all peaceful means and that protects existing liberal democracies by all means necessary. Regarding Europe, in Ukraine, Russia is putting the alliance to the test, and we must not fail it. We should collectively give top priority to integrating Ukraine into the West economically as well as politically. The prospect of membership in the EU and NATO would provide incentives for Ukraine to accelerate long-needed reforms, and it would give hope to the forces within Ukraine, a popular majority, I believe, that yearn for stability, prosperity, and democracy. In the meantime, we should give Ukraine the arms it needs to defend itself. a policy that every member of the alliance should support. Germany should compensate Ukraine fully for the revenue losses that it will suffer when Nord Stream 2 is fully operational. And the transatlantic alliance should reach agreement on bold, creative diplomacy to go beyond the Minsk agreements and end the frozen conflict in Ukraine's eastern region once and for all. Turning now to the Pacific, a successful Chinese effort to retake Taiwan by force would undermine the US-led alliance to contain the PRC and open the door to China's domination of East Asia and the Pacific. This has become a central concern of America's defense and foreign policy, but it cannot be a peripheral matter for Europe either. In a recent report co-sponsored by the Aspen Strategy Group and the Munich Security Conference stated, quote, both sides of the Atlantic would be adversely affected by China encroaching on the sovereignty and independence of Indo-Pacific nations and would be gravely harmed by Chinese hegemony over the region. In a recent article, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, a former NATO Secretary General, bluntly underscored this new reality. Quote, if America loses its dominance in the Indo-Pacific, it will trigger a shock wave in global power balances that will engulf Europe too. Rasmussen criticized the myopic mercantilism that he saw at work in economic relations between Europe and China, and he warned Europe against the temptation to act as a balancing power between China and the United States. In the battle for global preeminence, he concluded, Europe cannot remain neutral without diminishing America's long-term commitment to the transatlantic alliance. This is the truth, and I could not agree more with his statement. It would be unreasonable for the United States to expect its European allies to contribute significantly to the military dimension against rising Chinese power. But Europe can participate in other ways. On the diplomatic front, Europe must stand unambiguously for the principle that the future of Taiwan must be settled through peaceful agreement between Beijing and Taipei and not by force. Europe can also play an important role on the economic front. Under Xi Jinping, the always blurry line between Chinese firms and the Chinese Communist Party has been erased, and all technological gains can be converted to military use. Every European and American firm doing business in China will be subjected to pressure to transfer key technologies into Chinese hands. It is essential that European firms, as well as American firms, resist this pressure, even if it restricts profitable business opportunities in the PRC. Vladimir Lenin famously remarked that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. Let us make sure that his prophecy does not come true this time with a new rising communist nation. I want to conclude with a few words to the many young people attending this conference. My generation will soon fade from the scene. Then it will be your turn to defend liberal democracy or, God forbid, yield to its adversaries. Winston Churchill once remarked, quoting, I should add, an unnamed predecessor, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. This wry Churchillian maxim sums up the difficulties that you, the leaders of the future, will face. Democracy is usually untidy and frequently unlovable. When we are eager to act, it requires patience. When we are sure we are right, it counsels compromise. coordinating the variety of interests and beliefs that freedom evokes into a common plan of action is akin, Max Weber once remarked, to the slow drilling of hard boards. It is easy to envy the power of autocracies to act quickly, and intellectuals often have. It is harder to remain passionate about democracy unless we stay focused on the alternatives, whose hallmark is the suppression of legitimate difference in a false unity maintained by force and fear. Nothing in human affairs is immutable or inevitable. As there is no end to the threat of war, there is no end of history. The strongest of human creations will collapse unless they are defended and renewed. The most vulnerable causes can prevail if we are willing to fight for them. And even when liberty loses, the setback need not be permanent. Liberal democracy will die only if we cease to believe in it. History does not take sides in the struggle between liberty and oppression, or between democracy and autocracy. The future is what we, that is, you, will make of it. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. I present the next speaker. Don't clap yet, otherwise I'll be fired from this role. Professor Clifford Irwin is a professor and a fellow at St. Michael's College and senior fellow of Massey College at the University of Toronto. He is also a distinguished visiting fellow at Hoover Institution of Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Bochum Thucydides Center at Ruhr University Bochum. The author of many articles, and you have won 3 awards for teaching. Thank you. You may clap now.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Johanna. I was delighted to see that Lord Plant could participate in this session. I've always greatly admired him, so I'm going to follow in the footsteps of his moving tribute to Rolf Dahrendorf and his account of his own relations with Dahrendorf to say something about our current speaker and my relations with him. I've now known Bill Galston for 57 years and have spent countless hours in his company. I wish that I had succeeded in absorbing all he has brought to these many encounters, but alas, I can make no such claim. Somehow, his superior grasp of the world always remains just beyond my reach. True, he's a year older than I am, and a year is a long time. So perhaps he's just profited from this unfair head start. In an earlier draft of this speech, Bill began by recapitulating the situation out of which the Atlantic Alliance first arose 80 years ago, and the response to that situation that it embodied. He offered high praise of Roosevelt and Churchill. He wrote in that version, quote, "At a time when victory against fascism and militarism was anything but assured, they had the courage to imagine a world of self-governing nations, secure within their borders, free to decide how to govern themselves, enjoying unhindered access to the seas and to the sources of prosperity." End of quote. In this earlier draft of the speech, Bill gives the 2 great Anglo-Saxon statesmen high marks for their blend of idealism and realism, neither of which, as both recognized, was sufficient without the other. In the event, they succeeded where it was most urgent that they do so, in winning mankind's war against enemies so evil and formidable as to threaten the very survival of liberal democracy. This was the task of their day, and of course their soaring rhetoric was primarily a means to achieving it. The Atlantic Charter was thus the prototype of all alliances of liberal democratic states confronted with the hostility of illiberal ones. Born of a dark time, it offered the solace of a brighter one, that dreamed of by liberal thinkers ever since Immanuel Kant, that time when the international system would dance to the music of liberalism. Confronting such sinister foes bent on destroying liberal democracy, Roosevelt and Churchill had to find the right words to rally its supporters. Their vision of a better world, as sketched in the Atlantic Charter, doubtless expressed their deepest hopes. It also expressed their recognition that the very survival of democracy was at issue. In practice, the free world whose principles the Charter sought to express had been reduced to the Anglosphere. While this earlier passage was finely wrought, Bill chose to omit it. Instead, he began by calling our attention not to past glories, but to present uncertainties. He wrote, "As we meet to remember the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, which set the stage for one of the greatest triumphs in Western history, we must look with fresh eyes at the very different challenges we face today. It is a time for reflection and innovation, not celebration." Bill may well have concluded that his moving appreciation of the statecraft of Churchill and Roosevelt would have struck precisely that celebratory note that he wished to discourage. So instead of taking us back to the dark but glorious days of 1941, he decided to waft us back only as far as the prematurely giddy ones of 1991. That was the heyday of the notion of the end of history, which meant the end of serious threats to the hegemony of liberal democracy. The watersheds of the new era were the demise of the Soviet Union and the successful quasi-global effort to repel the aggression of Saddam Hussein, an effort in which even Japan participated and to which not even Russia and China objected. This was the point at which the Atlantic Alliance and its successor institutions, including even the United Nations, appeared to have succeeded or to be well on the way to success at their main task, the progressive liberal democratization of the world. That hasn't happened. By Bill's reckoning, this trend continued only until 2006 or so. Since then, the principles of the Atlantic Alliance, now become those of global liberal democracy, have struggled to hold their own against illiberal rivals, such as Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and a bewildering variety of others, including, of course, jihadi groups. Some of the problems confronting the liberal democratic bloc have arisen from its very success. With a stable of liberal democratic countries so much larger than before, so much more diffuse geographically, so economically, culturally, and militarily diverse, the task of coordinating common action becomes exponentially more complicated. This greater profusion of allies entails as well an expansion of the actual or possible enemies against which the democracies must exercise vigilance. Hence, the unpredicted emergence of liberal democracy in East Asia has raised the stakes for the United States in that region, just as the flourishing democracies of the Baltic states have challenged it to confront Russia with more than just strategic territory on the line. Bill's full-throated call for greater integration of Ukraine into the Western Alliance raises this question quite bluntly. Just how far should the Western democracies go, how many risks run, and how many costs incur to come to the rescue of this liberal democratic outlier, this would-be or wannabe liberal democracy? Yes, liberal democracy expanded its terrain, but in so doing, did it overextend itself? Bill has offered a depressing chronicle of the years following 2006. It is not just that the foes of liberal democracy have bolstered their positions, but that we liberal democratic states have aided and abetted them in doing so. Bill stated numerous criticisms of the behavior of both the United States and its allies during the past 15 years, and I agreed with most of them. A repeated problem with all parties has been their willingness to place economic advantage ahead of the fundamental and therefore long-term interest of liberal democracy itself. Bill calls on us, and if I may turn as he did to address the young people here, calls on you to do better in this crucial respect. That Bill concludes with this injunction raises an issue in his speech no less salient for the fact that it remains merely implicit in it. Near the beginning of the speech, he notes that in the past 3 decades, quote, the external threat to democracy, mainly from a resurgent Russia and a rising China, has intensified, unquote. He states that, quote, This threat from the outside will be the focus of his remarks today, unquote. Certainly he has expounded that threat with remarkable thoroughness and precision for so short a talk. He has not and could not treat the issues internal to liberal democracy as expansively. Yet the hortatory note on which he ends his speech is haunting. Bill's natural bent is analytical, and we might even say dialectical rather than rhetorical. In his youth, his trademark expression was distinguo, drawn from the usage of formal scholastic disputation. At the end of this speech, however, he waxed notably rhetorical in turning to address the young people here. He stressed that the future of liberal democracy was in no way assured, whether for better or for worse. He suggested that the crucial consideration was not what the world presented us as guaranteeing by some preordained historical writ either the failure of liberalism or its success. The problem is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Here he cites with Shakespeare's Epicurean Cassius against his Stoic Brutus. In conclusion, he quotes the final intended public pronouncement of FDR, found among his papers at his death, quote, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith." A strong and active faith in liberal democracy? I cannot speak of European or East Asian universities, but of North American ones, I say with certainty that they preach no such faith. To their inmates, Roosevelt's words, like all such high-flown statements by dead white males, register as quaint, if not simply hollow. Students today are much more likely to be taught skepticism toward liberal democracy as such than any version of faith in it. This being the case, I will pose a question concerning Bill's conclusion. While he offers a ringing vindication of a liberal democracy, it is also somehow a minimalist one. He repeats Churchill's famous judgment that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. He buttresses that judgment with specific references to the evils of totalitarianism, some of which have emerged only since Churchill made his statement, as indeed they continue to emerge daily from places like China and North Korea. Yet there was a distance between that Churchill, that wry Churchill, as Bill called him, and the one who shared the podium with Roosevelt to issue the Atlantic Charter. The latter declaration offers a more affirmative vision of democracy. To move forward as urged by Roosevelt and Galston with a strong and active faith in democracy, especially in this new age of deep skepticism toward it, might not some such more affirmative vision be required? To borrow another favorite Latin term of the youthful Galston, quaeritur, one asks.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Guillaume, a professor of politics and the director of the International School of Caucasus Studies in University of Tbilisi. He is also the founder of the Caucasus Institute for Peace, Democracy and Development, an independent think tank for public policy in Tbilisi, and was also a minister for Georgia in the areas of science and education. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this introduction and for having me here again at this wonderful gathering. And as everybody, I will, of course, start with thanking João for having this institution flourishing for such a long time. I also may start with on the same note as Bill, in the sense that okay, so many things has already been said, and maybe it would be better not to deliver a lecture at all, but there is a sense of duty. So Bill did that. So in my case, I think I basically agree with everything that Bill said. So what to discuss, but I have a sense of duty to share my thoughts anyway. So maybe I will start with saying what exactly I agree with in Bill's speech. One is what he calls for. I think what his policy recommendations, as it were, are. And those are, as I understand, that the West should be confidence, needs much greater confidence in its power. It has to be much more strategic and long-term and much more unified in facing and addressing those threats that come in today's world, especially from hostile regimes in China and Russia, and first of all to recognize them as regimes that are hostile to future of democracy in these countries, but also globally. And I also, second thing which I agree with is his assessment that it's not what's happening, that the West is not good at doing its job. The transatlantic community is not good at this job. So on these 2 points, I fully agree. So what is there to discuss? I think the main issue to discuss is whether he expects transatlantic community to follow on his recommendations and get its act together. And that was not fully clear from his lecture, what his expectations are on that. So basically, we come down to this general question whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic about this. And of course, I don't have an answer to that. I cannot have this claim, but I will share some views of that. So as to grounds for pessimism, I had this feeling while I first read the draft of the speech and then listened to it, whether these views or these approaches, even though I share them, are old-fashioned or sound old-fashioned to quite a few people, or whether it is against zeitgeist, as it were, in today's world. So whether we live in the world where more realpolitik kind of thinking is more considered more up to date. And what I mean here is what is a dividing line between these two approaches is whether the nature of the regime, democratic or undemocratic, is so much relevant for making your policy choices when you make them. And I guess that failures in Afghanistan, of course, that were mentioned, or in Iraq, or the failure in a way of Arab Spring has nurtured this turn in a way in thinking in favor of more realpolitik approach, that this putting democracy at the center of foreign policy, international policy, is kind of too naive and too American, as it were, too idealistic in an American, naive American way. So we need more maybe European style of deep wisdom in dealing with these issues. What can we say to that? Is it true or not? Okay, I happen to believe that this issue is somewhat short-sighted. This view, kind of realpolitik approach, is sort of short-sighted. That yes, I fully appreciate also the point that Dr. Barroso made on the previous session, that democracies need to work with autocratic regimes sometimes, and it's not only about COVID or climate change, which are apparently sort of non-political issues, but also on very security-related issues, like, for instance, Roosevelt and Churchill, they not only signed this Atlantic Charter, but they also cooperated with Stalin who was, you know, not very nice guy, or with Salazar, and Portuguese dictator also. But it's usually people don't criticize them for that because, you know, it obviously was the only way. So democracies have to make these tactical alliances when there is a greater threat for greater dictator. And at that particular point in time, Hitler was a greater threat. So they had to ally with Stalin, although, well, soon after Hitler was defeated, they started to unite against Stalin. So that's as old as politics, of course, this kind of changes and somewhat Machiavellian politics. But having said that, I think it would be very short-sighted again and wrong to imagine that democracies can at any time divorce their foreign policies and international policies from necessity to defend democracy, because democracies, by their very existence, they create a threat to autocracies. So autocracies will always fight democracies because they find their very existence destabilizing. So yes, it's maybe justified, unavoidable rather, to sometimes make tactical agreements with autocrats against more dangerous and more powerful autocrats. But at that, autocrats which happen to be more dangerous and more powerful at that particular moment, and we have to accept that sad reality, as it were. But it is only justified because there is greater threat, as I said. So therefore, this kind of policies that we can't change autocrats just by appeasing them and engaging them, it may be seen attractive in the short term, but I think it's not only kind of wise, but it's actually unwise policy in the long term. It's kind of short-termism in a way. But the problem is, of course, to which I have to return, that yes, we may say that in this conference, but how likely it is that these policies of the West will become actually more strategic and more unified and more comprehensive. What should happen for that? How much can we hope for that? And in that we can again maybe remember the circumstances when Atlantic Charter was signed. Was it a better time for democracy? Yes, the text sounds very good, very encouraging also today. And on the hindsight, because we know what happened afterwards, we can see it as kind of roadmap for some good things that happened afterwards. But we also remember that that meeting, while it produced Atlantic Charter, was not terribly successful, maybe, if we look from a geopolitical point of view, because the United States refused to join the war. And the UK was basically alone against Hitler and was considered kind of doomed to lose. And until US was directly attacked by Japan, it did not join the war because okay, I guess American public was against it. So maybe Roosevelt thought otherwise personally, but again, that zeitgeist, internal American zeitgeist, was against joining the war somewhere in Europe. All these distant wars, you know, they are not so popular usually. So, and if had US and the UK lost that war, would we celebrate Atlantic Charter today or try to revive it? I'm not sure. So What I'm trying to say, and I know I have to finish, I don't know whether it's a good ground for optimism. I think there are two grounds of optimism. First, it's about so-called fundamentals. That yes, and as economists always often say that yes, we are now in trouble, there is some kind of crisis, but look at fundamentals. Fundamentally, we are still strong. I think fundamentally, if we look at resources of democratic world, whether it's hard power, economic power, or so-called soft power, I think it's still quite powerful. It just needs to get its act together, as I said, as Bill said, and I agree. But also, I think my feeling is that maybe things are not bad enough yet, that this 15 years long decline of democracy is bad, but not bad enough to wake people up in democratic world. So maybe we need some more trigger, stronger trigger, to unify against common threats. Thanks a lot.
And now I present the final discussants, Mr. William Crystal, who has taught politics at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University, who was the founder of the Weekly Standard and edited this magazine for 2 decades. He is an author, a scholar, and a former White House advisor, a founding director of Defending Democracy Together, and the editor-at-large of The Bulwark. Mr. Crystal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, of course, and hope next year we will make it back to Estoril. You know, at the Seder, the Passover Seder, Jews all around the world conclude the Seder with the statement, next year in Jerusalem. And I feel that you all are there, so you should enjoy it. But Susan and I certainly look forward to next year, I hope, God willing, in Estoril. And, you know, I once asked someone, what is the next year in Jerusalem? Is that simply a statement of Zionism, of where we hope to be, you know, geographically? And a learned person with whom I was discussing this said, no, I mean, Jerusalem means both. Of course, people wanted to go back to Jerusalem before the state of Israel. There was the sort of Zionist, you might say, message. But also Jerusalem meant Jerusalem in the broader sense, you know, a higher place than our daily lives and the daily lives of Jews scattered around the world, especially in unfree states and states where they were persecuted. And I do feel that way about Estoril too, about the political forum, that it's not just, it's a beautiful place and it's nice people and it's fun to be there, but it also stands for a kind of, as Bill Dawson suggested, a kind of dialogue and discussion and robust debate that really is liberal democracy at its best, or close to its best. And so I think it's very important what is happening there, both because, as I say, for the participants themselves, but it's an example of what should happen more in more places, more often. I'll just say a word and a couple of points, and they're very consistent with what almost everyone else has said, since I don't know that we differ much, but I'll make 2 points, really. On the Atlantic Charter, I mean, I had a similar point to my predecessor there. You know, the truth is the Atlantic Charter wouldn't be much remembered if the UK and the US and our allies hadn't won the war. And even at the time, incidentally, it was kind of a big deal. But if you go look at a typical history, I did a couple of them quickly, of World War II, it's not the most important thing that happened in 1941. The most important thing that happened was what happened before 1941, when Britain stood alone and beat back the Nazi assault, and also Churchill stood and beat back the attempts at appeasement within Britain a year before. And that was the precondition for the UK joining the US in an Atlantic Charter. That was not predestined. It would perfectly plausible alternate history where the UK as a kind of complies with the Nazi domination of Europe, doesn't become a Nazi regime, probably not even quite a Vichy regime, but not standing up to Nazi Germany. The other thing that happens, of course, a month or two before, I guess it's 2 months before maybe, the Atlantic Charter is Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, of Russia, which is a rather important historical fact. And then the fact that it fails, that the Soviet Union and the Russian people maybe deserve more of the credit, defeat the Nazi invasion, That history was contingent, needn't have happened that way. Thank God there were mistakes made by Hitler, and the Russians turned out to be awfully tough, even despite terrible rule of Stalin and terrible mismanagement of the war, as I understand it, by Stalin as well. And so that effort by the dictators failed. And then, of course, the Japanese attacked us. And as was pointed out, we were not in the war. The Atlantic Charter was important because Roosevelt leaned pretty far forward in getting as close as he could, you might say, to being an ally of Britain. And there was some practical side of that too, with the Lend-Lease and other efforts. But we were not, it's not clear we would have come in, you know, if there hadn't been an attack on us. And then Hitler foolishly declared war on us 2 days after the Japanese attack. So history is very contingent. And what happened on the ground, so to speak, matters. What happened in terms of the actual war mattered an awful lot. Colin Powell died early this morning, and I wrote a little thing on the Bulwark website, but I quoted something he had said in response to criticism in a way of the US for depending too much on hard power. This was by someone who wanted to advocate for soft power, actually George Carey, the former Archbishop of England, at a conference in 2003, I think, and I won't read it to you, you can look it up, but Powell gives an eloquent defense of soft power in all its forms, persuasion, but also diplomacy, economic power, and so forth. I guess that's semi-soft power, maybe the economy. But he says without hard power, none of it quite works. At least doesn't work all the time or some of the time. And there are moments you have to use hard power, and in the background, for much of the time, there has to be hard power to support soft power. I think that's an important point to make, maybe especially, I'm very much in favor of celebrating the Atlantic Charter, don't get me wrong, but especially when one is celebrating a charter, one wants to remember that behind the charter has to be the elements of power, of force, you know, justice without, it may be that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, as American politicians like to say, quoting Martin Luther King, but it's even if it does bend slightly towards justice, it still needs force to, justice needs force to support it. And so just an obvious point, but one worth remembering, which does get to then practical questions of, are we strong enough to deal with the world? Are we and our allies strong enough? Are our alliances strong enough? I'm very glad Bill emphasized the importance of alliances. But all of Europe, which is awfully powerful and important economically, A, it's not entirely engaged necessarily economically in supporting liberal democracy against its enemies, and B, you know, it's not, we just take it for granted that Europe spends an astonishingly small percentage of its GDP on defense. I don't know, maybe that was worked for 30, 40, 50 years. We were able to sustain, you know, most of we spent about twice as much as a percentage of GDP, and that was enough together. But it's not clear it's enough going forward. And there's a kind of still complacency, I would say, about that. Asia, there's more rethinking. The Chinese threat is much closer, but then there are some tough decisions to be made in Japan and elsewhere about which way they go forward. So I think being serious about foreign policy and about the security and power elements of foreign policy, as well as, and I'm very strong on this too, on the liberal democracy side, as it were, the principles of foreign policy, help the defending and helping liberal democratic regimes, both elements are awfully important. So that maybe puts the Atlantic Charter in kind of a context. The other thing I would say is it wasn't inevitable that Roosevelt would be president. It wasn't inevitable that the Republican Party would have nominated Wendell Willkie in 1940, and that Willkie, having lost the election, ended up supporting Roosevelt in 1941 and supported the Atlantic Charter, actually. And so you had two parties that, from my point of view, I think most of our points of view, that kind of were trying to do the right thing from about 1939, 1940 on. It's not always that way in a political system, obviously. And there were threats. There was more isolationist wing of the Republican Party. I would say a respectable isolationist wing led by Robert Taft. There was an America First movement that was very strong. And interestingly, America First, I'd always vaguely assumed, and I only looked this up sort of when Trump emerged and used the term, that America First was kind of a late 1930s thing. You know, let's stay out of these European troubles as troubles mount and increase. America First is a 1940, 1941 phenomenon. It was stronger in 1941 than it was in 1940. So it wasn't as if it was one American public opinion on either side was committed to standing up for liberty against threats. And in fact, and then until the Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler, of course, the left, at least the far left, was not in favor of US intervention. So again, it's the degree to which the center held, if you want to use that term, in America in 40-41, but it wasn't quite as inevitable as we now seem to assume it was. Yeats, of course, has that famous poem, what is that, 1919, I think, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And that's often been taken as a prescient understanding of much of Europe and Asia too, Japan, in the 1920s and 30s. I think one of the appreciated stories maybe is that the center did hold barely in the UK and in the US and in other nations in 39, 40, 41. And then, and more relevantly, and maybe I'll just close with this, in the late 40s, after the war, despite the exhaustion of this war and everyone wanting to come home, the center held in the US in, for example, 1948, when we had Harry Truman, not the president one necessarily would have expected ahead of time to rise to the occasion. I mean, interesting person, but a kind of second-tier senator. The Republican Party also, again, turned its back mostly on the isolationists. We had movements on right and left, McCarthyism and Henry on the right, Henry Wallace on the left. Neither succeeded, and we ended up with a reasonable bipartisan consensus that mostly held for about 40 years, not a minor achievement. So the center can hold. I think people are too pessimistic that somehow the center never holds and that mere anarchy gets loosed upon the world, but the center holds only by people working awfully hard and purposefully to hold it, to rebuild it, to reinvigorate it. And liberal democracy doesn't just chug along with no enemies or threats from without or within. And it takes both intelligence and understanding of how to strengthen the institutions and mores and habits of liberal democracy, also with intelligence in devising policies, and then strength and courage, really, and just standing up for liberal democracy. And that's not something we can take for granted.
So thank you to all panelists. We've gone from Taiwan to Afghanistan, from London to Washington, from Newfoundland to Estoril. We've spoken about not very nice guys, and we've spoken about naive guys. We've spoken about realpolitik and special relationships. And we've gone back to 1941, and then back to the present, and off to the future. And because students are the future, but especially the present, the table has decided that we will discriminate. And we will ask for 3 questions from students. We ask you to be really brief and precise, and to identify yourselves before the question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel. My name is João Freitas. I'm a student at Nova University and at the Catholic University. My question is regarding European nihilism in the face of China and Russia. Isn't that justifying the United States shifting off its alliances to the Indo-Pacific, to things like AUKUS or the Five Eyes?
Thank you, João. I think we'll take the other 2 very brief and precise questions, and then the panelists will answer. Nobody? Yes, please.
Thanks very much. I'm not actually currently a student, but a very quick question. In his lecture, Professor Galston spoke of the importance of Taiwan and the importance of America and Europe, standing together, defending Taiwan, if I remember correctly. But in all honesty, can Professor Galston really see the United States taking military action to defend Taiwan if China actually did launch an invasion? Because personally, I really can't see that happening. But that's not important. I'd love to know your view.
Thank you. Third and last question. Okay, so we'll take the 2 questions. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Yes, please.
And I just wanted to ask, Dr. Willem Galston, you mentioned that the U.S. made some mistakes when it comes to compromising with our union, with NATO, and you also mentioned that Germany and France did it. But what about the other countries? What about the rest of Europe? I understand that France and Germany are seen as the great powers of the European Union. But what about the other countries? What did we lose, and what do we have to reinstitute? Because the United States, they did something bad, but there was something bad done to them too, or something that wasn't compromised. And so did France and Germany. But what about smaller countries? We didn't do anything wrong when it comes to compromising the pact. I'm sorry. That's just my question.
Thank you very much. So, professors.
Well, I believe that the first question concerned European nihilism, if I heard that correctly. Is that what you said? I tried to keep my remarks on the political level, and I say that as someone who has studied the history of ideas since I was younger than you are, and I believe that that's important. But in the current situation, I think it's not necessary to resort to such large intellectual categories in order to understand why Europe is doing what it's doing, or why Europe isn't doing some other things that many of us wish it would. I'll be happy to discuss that question in greater depth face to face, but that would be my immediate reaction. The second student question. There's a method. The second student question can be summarized, well, I talked about France and Germany, what about the rest of Europe? Now, I could say in my defense that I also had some words about Greece and Spain. I exempted Portugal from my... What, as in what Europe did? Yeah, it is. Yep.
When you mentioned Spain, you said that it comes to what China did and the companies that China has on Spain. And when you mentioned Greece, you talked about what they said that they didn't agree with. But it doesn't come to what did they actually do? What did Spain do but to not compromise the pacts that the countries have in NATO?
Well, I pointed out that in Greece, as the result of Chinese investment and Chinese pressure that they were able to exert because of that investment, Greece actually blocked an EU resolution criticizing China for violations of human rights. I didn't have time to go through all of the smaller countries, but I will say this very confidently, that the Chinese are not making these investments as charitable ventures. They expect something in return, and they are not as yet making money on the ports. So what is it that they expect in return? And the answer is diplomatic influence, as the example of Greece. So smaller countries that admit what I've called Trojan ports into their gates are asking for trouble, and the only question is when that trouble arrives, but I can assure you that it will. Okay, with regard to the third question, will the United States come to the defense of Taiwan? The answer is I don't know the answer to that question, and regrettably, I don't think the President of the United States knows the answer to that question either. I am making a proposal, not a prediction. But I don't make proposals that I know cannot succeed. Okay, we have reached the end of our time, so I have a 30-second announcement. I meant what I said at the beginning of my speech about my preference for dialogue over monologue. I haven't slept in a while, but I don't expect to, so for a while. So with that in mind, I have asked the conference to reserve the tropical room after our final official event this evening, which I think ends at 2200. And I will be in that room. And if any students want to come and continue this discussion, I will be happy to receive them. I will not be insulted in the slightest if you decide that you'd prefer to go to a party instead, because I cannot promise you a party.
I thank you, Professor, for your selflessness. Regarding lack of hours of sleep. I would like to ask if any of the other panel speakers would like to have a closing remark, brief and precise.
No, that's no. I will join Professor Galston in that. Mr. Galston, Bill, I will join him in that room.
Wow. So I am supposed to announce that there is the Winston Memorial Dinner.
Yes. So the announcement now after this session is, of course, thank you to all of you and this very stimulating debate. We will have a lot more to debate, but we can, of course, do it also over dinner and not only that night. And just two very brief announcements. So the Winston Churchill Memorial Dinner next door, I think we can all smell not the coffee, but the fish already waiting for us at 8:15. And then we still have tonight, or evening, late evening show at 10:15 p.m., the IEP Alumni Club General Assembly with Eric Bournay, and also the late night conversation with Professor William Galston. So it starts this forum of the EP in a very promising way. It was a great day and it still goes on. Thank you for all of you, and see you later.